Arachnophobia. Beneath the earth, the world is not just dark, it is alive. Dylan McCabe was the kind of man who lived in darkness for a living. An experienced caver with a reputation for conquering the most brutal underground passages, he had descended into caverns that twisted, squeezed, and swallowed the brave, only to emerge again with a knowing grin and a story no one else could tell. His passion for exploration had kept him alive so far, but in his chest, an unfamiliar feeling had begun to grow, an insidious itch he couldn't scratch. Fear, not of the dark or the unknown, but of something far more primal, far more disturbing. Spiders. He had never been one to succumb to weakness, and yet, since his childhood, the sight of a spider, any spider, had made his blood freeze. The eight-legged creatures filled his dreams and haunted his waking hours. He'd always brushed off his fear as something childish, but as he grew older, he realized that fear only bloomed in his silence. The thought of it made him ashamed, furious, and now, as his career as a caver reached its apex, he could not ignore the tightness in his chest when he thought of them. It was then that he made a decision, a final reckless attempt to conquer both his fear and the abyss that lay in the deepest, most inhospitable cavern he had yet to explore. The Black Hollow. The Black Hollow was a myth, a labyrinth buried beneath the Alps, forgotten by all but a few locals who spoke in whispers, narrow, suffocating, its walls crawling with life. It was said that no one had survived the descent, no one but the stories of the spiders, giant webbed monsters that ruled the underworld with their cold, unblinking eyes. Dylan was ready. He would go in alone, armed only with his rope, his torch, and his confidence. And when he emerged, his fear would be gone forever. The air smelled of damp stone and decay as Dylan entered the Black Hollow. His headlamp barely illuminated the jagged walls, narrowing by the foot with every passing moment. The descent was long and unforgiving, the tunnel so tight at points that he had to twist his body sideways to fit. But Dylan wasn't afraid. He was exhilarated. For years, he'd sought something that would challenge him, push him to the brink. As he descended deeper, the oppressive darkness seemed to close in, muffling the sound of his breathing. The further he went, the more he realized that the stories were true. The walls of the cave weren't smooth. They were covered in sticky, glistening webs. And the deeper he went, the thicker they became, thick as ropes, the strands shifting as if alive. There was no turning back now. He pressed on. Hours passed. The air grew colder, the webs denser, until Dylan could no longer ignore the creeping sensation at the back of his mind. Spiders. He could feel their presence in the thick webs, could sense their skittering beneath the rock. His chest tightened. The air was wrong here. Something ancient. Something hungry. He shuddered, and then a sharp rustle. His head spun. He raised his torch, casting light across the narrow passage, and there they were. Spiders. Massive, grotesque creatures, their legs stretching far longer than any he'd seen before. Their eyes gleamed like black jewels, unblinking and cold, fixed upon him with an unnerving intelligence. Dylan's throat went dry, his heart hammered. The spiders, each the size of a cat, hung motionless in the webs, as if waiting for him to move. He backed up, but the tunnel was narrowing. He couldn't retreat. His breath became shallow, ragged. He knew the moment he turned, the moment he tried to run, it would be over. They would swarm. He had nowhere to go. He had to confront them. In a single impulsive motion, he swiped his hand through the nearest web, sending it scattering. The spiders didn't move at first, but then, as if beckoned, the creatures began to stir, their legs curling and stretching with disturbing grace. They were watching him, waiting. Then a low click, a noise that vibrated through the stone. A single spider descended from the ceiling, its movements deliberate, its body gleaming in the dim light. Dylan's skin crawled. It landed in front of him, its mandibles clicking, its enormous abdomen swaying. And there, in the dim, twisted silence, Dylan realized something terrifying. It was hungry. The spider reared back and then pounced. What followed was an unfathomable nightmare. Dylan, in his desperation, lashed out, driving his boot into the creature's abdomen, crushing it against the rock. But there were more spiders crawling from every crevice, every shadow, skittering across the floor, the walls, the ceiling. The tunnel became a living web of claws and fangs, pulsing with hunger. The fear that had once paralyzed him now surged through his veins like fire. But in that fire, something broke. Something deep inside him snapped. He was no longer the confident, skilled caver. He was an animal, a thing that needed to survive. He fought like a man possessed, stomping on spiders, his hands tearing at webs with desperation. But even as he killed, more appeared, larger, faster, angrier. Dylan, gasping for breath, realized the only way out was through. He could feel his stomach twist as he grabbed the nearest spider, its legs thrashing against his fingers. He didn't think. He simply acted. With shaking hands, he tore the creature in half. The legs, the body, the blood, it all went down, raw, twitching. He could taste the venom on his tongue. The crunch of its exoskeleton echoed in the silence of the cave. He retched but swallowed. Over the next hours, days perhaps, he lost track, Dylan was forced to eat the spiders. They became his sustenance, his only hope of survival. The cave pressed in on him, and as he choked down the writhing, venomous creatures, he felt his fear begin to numb. His body grew weak, but his mind hardened. There was no other choice. The spiders were everywhere. But each bite, each gruesome meal, slowly dissolved his phobia. He wasn't terrified anymore. The hunger, the pain, the desperation, it all blurred together, until he couldn't remember what it was like to be afraid. The only thing that mattered was survival. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the spiders disappeared. Dylan, exhausted, bruised, covered in webs and blood, staggered through the now empty tunnels. He had survived the black hollow. He had survived it by becoming something else. When he emerged, blinking into the light, the air felt foreign. His face was gaunt, his body covered in sores, his mind fractured. But his fear was gone. The world no longer held power over him. He was unshaken, unmoved. The arachnophobia was gone. But the man who had conquered it, he was lost to the dark.